Imagine standing on a hilltop, the air thick with smoke, the clash of iron echoing across the valley. Below you, tens of thousands of warriors roar in defiance, men who believe they are fighting for the freedom of their homeland. And facing them, a single man, calm and calculating, whose mind is already 3 steps ahead. His name is Julius Caesar. The place is Alesia. And what's about to unfold is one of the most brilliant and daring military strategies in the history of warfare. What if I told you that Caesar, with fewer men, surrounded by enemies on all sides, managed to trap and defeat an army nearly twice his size? What if I told you that he didn't just build one wall, but 2 fortifications stretching for miles, cutting his enemies off from both escape and rescue? And what if I told you that this single gamble would decide the fate of Gaul and secure Caesar's path to power in Rome? Stay with me, because this is not just history, it's a story of desperation, cunning, betrayal, and sheer human will. And by the end, you'll see why Alesia remains a masterclass in strategy. So, are you ready? Let's begin. The storm before Alesia's story of Alesia does not begin with the clang of swords or the clash of shields. It begins years earlier with an ambitious Roman general who saw not just soldiers and provinces, but destiny written in the soil of foreign lands. Julius Caesar was no ordinary commander. He was a man with debts the size of empires, a hunger for glory that could never be satisfied, and a political career that was teetering on the edge of collapse. For Caesar, conquest was not merely expansion. It was survival. Have you ever felt like the walls were closing in, like every decision you made had to be perfect or everything would fall apart? That was Caesar's reality in 58 BCE. Rome was a boiling pot of rival factions, jealous senators, and shifting alliances. Caesar had borrowed obscene amounts of money to secure his political rise. If he returned home without victories, his enemies would destroy him. His answer: the conquest of Gaul. At the time, Gaul was not one kingdom but a patchwork of tribes, sometimes allies, often enemies, united only by language and fierce pride. To the Romans, these tribes were both a threat and an opportunity. For Caesar, they were a stage. His Gallic campaigns would provide him with the wealth, soldiers, and reputation to eclipse his rivals in Rome, and for 8 long years, Caesar waged war across the land we now know as France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland. It was brutal, it was bloody, and it was relentless. Imagine entire villages burned to ash, rivers red with blood, and legions marching through snow and mud, never resting, always hunting. Caesar's legions became machines of war, drilled to perfection, hardened by battle after battle. And yet, for all his victories, resistance in Gaul was never truly extinguished. Like embers beneath ashes, the spirit of freedom smoldered. All it needed was a leader to fan it into flame. That leader was Vercingetorix. His name alone sent chills through Roman ranks. Tall, fierce, and charismatic, Vercingetorix was no ordinary chieftain. He had the rare ability to unite the fractious Gallic tribes under a single cause, to drive Caesar and his legions from their homeland once and for all. For centuries, Gauls had resisted the encroaching Romans, but never before had they been so united. Under Vercingetorix, they became more than warriors. They became an army with a vision. Picture the scene: fires burning in Gallic villages. Not because Rome had torched them, but because the Gauls themselves destroyed their homes and fields, scorched earth style, to deny Caesar food and supplies. This was not just war, it was sacrifice on a monumental scale. Vercingetorix's strategy was as cruel as it was brilliant: starve the Romans, cut them off from resources, force them to retreat. And at first, it worked. Caesar's supply lines strained. His men grumbled. His enemies in Rome whispered that perhaps Gaul would finally break him, but Caesar was no ordinary adversary. He adapted, as he always did. He turned setbacks into opportunities. In 52 BC, after a series of brutal clashes, Vercingetorix retreated with his forces to a stronghold called Alesia, a hilltop fortress surrounded by valleys and rivers. To the Gauls, it was a safe haven. To Caesar, it was the perfect trap. Let's pause here for a moment and picture Alesia. Imagine a massive plateau rising above the surrounding plains, its sides steep and defensible, with a Gallic settlement on top and walls protecting its people. From above, it looked unassailable. Inside, Vercingetorix and his warriors felt secure. The Gauls believed Caesar could never crack such a fortress, and if Caesar attacked, reinforcements from the rest of Gaul would come crashing down upon the Romans from behind. Surely, this would be Caesar's doom, but what if I told you Caesar saw something entirely different? What if I told you that, instead of attacking the walls, he planned to build walls of his own? Walls not to keep himself in, but to keep the Gauls inside. That decision, audacious, insane, almost unthinkable, would become the centerpiece of his genius. The Roman legions marched toward Alesia. Dust rose from their sandals, shields glinted in the sun, and their eyes fell on the fortress where their fate and the fate of Gaul would be decided. For Caesar, this was no ordinary battle. This was the moment to either cement his legacy or lose everything. But how do you trap an army that outnumbers you? How do you hold ground when the enemy is not just before you, but also behind you, ready to descend at any moment? And how do you keep your men believing in your plan when the very soil they dig is soaked with their own sweat and blood? The answer lay in what Caesar would do next. He ordered the construction of a line of fortifications unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Miles of ditches, palisades, towers, and traps encircling Alesia like a tightening noose. And that was only the beginning, but before we step into that circle of iron and earth, we must first understand the stakes. This was not just a siege. This was a gamble of impossible proportions. If Caesar failed, the legions would be annihilated, his career destroyed, and Rome itself shaken. If he succeeded, Gaul would be crushed, his enemies in Rome silenced, and his path to absolute power wide open. The world held its breath, and as the first Roman shovels struck the soil around Alesia, a contest of wills began, one that would echo through history as the very definition of strategy. Walls of earth, walls of destiny. The first strike of the shovel into the soil was as significant as the clash of any sword. Julius Caesar had ordered his legions not to storm Alesia, but to surround it, not with men, but with earth, timber, and steel. To the Gauls watching from the high plateau, it must have seemed absurd. A Roman army, already outnumbered, choosing to dig rather than fight. But Caesar's men knew this was no ordinary campaign. They had followed him for years, from the rivers of Germany to the shores of Britain, and they had learned one lesson above all others. When Caesar told you to dig, you dug because he always saw farther than anyone else. Picture the scene. Thousands of legionaries stripped to their tunics, sweating under the sun, driving spades into the earth. The metallic rhythm of picks and shovels filled the air. Timber was hauled from nearby forests, sharpened into stakes, hammered into place. Gradually, a line began to snake around Alesia, a fortress not of stone, but of Roman discipline. This was the circumvallation, an encircling wall designed not to keep Romans safe, but to imprison the Gauls inside their stronghold. Caesar's vision was staggering. His men would build an unbroken chain of fortifications stretching more than 11 miles around Alesia. Imagine a line of trenches, ramparts, towers, and spikes so vast that no man inside the fortress could escape without running into Roman steel. Caesar was not simply besieging a city. He was turning the land itself into a weapon, and yet Caesar knew this was only half the battle. Because outside Alesia, beyond the horizon, tens of thousands of Gauls were rallying to Vercingetorix's cause. They would march to break the siege. They would come not as raiders, but as an enormous relief army, determined to crush Caesar between hammer and anvil. To survive, Caesar would need more than one wall. He would need two. The second wall, the contravallation, was even more audacious. It faced outward, not inward, designed to protect the Romans from the inevitable Gallic relief force. So imagine it. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix and his warriors trapped behind a wall of Roman earth. Outside, another army was forming, and Caesar's men built yet another wall to keep them out. And between those two walls, caught in a narrow strip of earth, were the legions themselves. It was a gamble beyond reason. Caesar had placed his men in the middle of two enemies, cutting off all chance of retreat. To the Gauls, this seemed like madness. To Caesar, it was brilliance. He had turned a battlefield into a trap, and in that trap he planned to crush not just one army, but all of Gaul's hopes. But brilliance on paper meant nothing without the blood to back it. The construction of the fortifications was brutal. Imagine working day and night under constant harassment. From the heights of Alesia, Gallic archers and slingers hurled missiles at the Romans. Cavalry raided their work details, forcing the legions to fight with spades in one hand and swords in the other. And yet the Romans pressed on, their discipline unshaken. Tower after tower rose into the sky, ditches deepened, stakes sharpened into lethal points. Caesar was not content with simple barriers. He ordered his engineers to devise obstacles so fearsome that even the bravest warrior would hesitate. Hidden pits lined with sharpened stakes, covered lightly with branches and soil, ready to impale any who stumbled in. Rows of pointed stakes driven into the ground like teeth, designed to rip apart cavalry charges. Ditches filled with water to slow attackers. These traps, called Sippi and Lilla, turned the land into a death zone. Anyone who tried to break out or break in would be funneled into slaughter. Let us pause here and consider the psychological weight of such works. For the Gauls inside Alesia, every day they looked down and saw the noose tightening. 11 miles of walls, ditches, and towers grew closer with each sunrise. Their once proud stronghold was becoming a prison. For the Gauls gathering outside, word spread of Caesar's impossible defenses. They were not coming to rescue allies. They were marching into the jaws of an elaborate trap. And for the Romans, they were caught in a nightmare. Surrounded on both sides, low on supplies, forced to labor endlessly, every man knew one truth: if Caesar's gamble failed, none of them would ever see Rome again. But Caesar held them together with iron will. He walked the lines, speaking to his soldiers, reminding them of their past victories, promising them that this, too, would end in glory. And the men believed, because Caesar never asked them to risk anything he himself would not risk. It is easy to see these walls as mere engineering marvels, but they were more than that. They were symbols. To the Romans, they were a statement of dominance, proof that their general could outthink any foe. To the Gauls, they were a cage, a reminder that every day spent inside Alesia brought them closer to starvation. And to Caesar, they were a gamble written in earth and timber, the key to victory or the path to ruin. Inside the fortress, life grew desperate. Vercingetorix had thousands of warriors, but mouths consume more than swords protect. Food began to run low. Supplies dwindled. The Gauls faced a terrible choice: fight their way out or starve within. But Vercingetorix knew his people were not alone. Across the countryside, he had sent riders to call for aid, to summon every tribe to the rescue. Reinforcements would come. They had to. Caesar knew it too. That was why he built not one wall, but two. He was preparing for a storm unlike any he had ever faced. And soon, scouts brought him the news. A massive Gallic relief army was marching toward Alesia. Estimates varied, but some sources suggest their numbers were over 200,000. Against them stood Caesar with less than half that number. 200,000 Gauls on the outside, tens of thousands on the inside, and between them Caesar's legions. Can you imagine the tension in the Roman camp on the night they heard the news? Fires burning low, men sharpening their swords in silence, the flicker of torchlight on nervous faces. They knew what was coming. Not just a battle, but a reckoning. And Caesar. He did not tremble. He waited. The trap was set. The stage was ready. The double walls stood as monuments to Roman discipline and Caesar's audacity. Now, the question was not whether the Gauls would attack, but when. The answer would come with the dawn. The hammer and the anvil of dawn broke over the hills around Alesia, and with it came a sound that chilled even the most hardened Roman veteran. From beyond the ridges, horns blared. War drums thundered. The earth itself seemed to tremble under the march of a vast host. The Gallic relief army had arrived. Imagine the sight from Caesar's walls. Dust clouds rising on the horizon, banners whipping in the wind, and then out of the haze an endless tide of warriors. Some came on horseback, their long mustaches fluttering as they rode. Others marched on foot, painted with blue woad, shields flashing in the morning sun. They carried spears, swords, and axes, shouting war cries that rolled like thunder across the plains. It was not an army. It was a nation in arms, every tribe of Gaul answering Vercingetorix's call. Inside Alesia, the trapped Gauls erupted in cheers. They rushed to the walls, shouting, waving weapons, hurling insults at the Romans below. Their deliverance had come. Soon the two armies inside and outside would smash Caesar's men between them, crushing the invader once and for all. For a brief moment, hope returned to the Gauls, but down in the Roman camp, Caesar stood unshaken. He had expected this. He had built for this. The double walls, the traps, the towers, all of it had been crafted for this very moment. Yet even Caesar knew the scale of the challenge. Perhaps 80,000 Gauls were trapped inside Alesia. Perhaps 200,000 more had now arrived outside. Against them, Caesar had only about 60,000 legionaries, auxiliaries, and cavalry. He was outnumbered at least 5 to 1. The relief army wasted no time. As the sun climbed, their warriors surged toward the outer Roman wall. Arrows and javelins rained down, ladders scraped against ramparts, and war cries filled the air. It was chaos made flesh. The Romans responded with machine-like precision, their peal of spears flying in deadly arcs, their shields locking into impenetrable walls. Every tower became a fortress, every trench a killing ground, but the sheer weight of numbers pressed hard. Gauls hurled themselves into the Roman ditches, filling them with their own bodies so others could climb over. Cavalry skirmishes broke out on the flanks, with Gallic horsemen trying to exploit weak points. The Romans fought like lions, but cracks began to appear, and then, as if on cue, Vercingetorix struck from within. Seeing the relief army engaged, he unleashed his cavalry and infantry against the inner Roman wall. Imagine the horror for Caesar's men, fighting for their lives on one side and suddenly hearing the roar of an attack behind them. The Gauls inside poured down the slopes, hurling javelins. Slamming against the inner fortifications, the Romans were now the anvil, and the Gauls hammered from both sides. Have you ever been caught between two impossible choices, where moving forward or backwards seemed certain death? That was the position of Caesar's legions. They fought with their backs to one wall and their faces to another, their shields battered, their arms aching, their ears filled with the cries of the dying. But here lay the genius of Caesar's double fortifications. The inner and outer walls were not simple ditches and fences. They were layered defenses, each trap and rampart designed to slow, bleed, and break the enemy. The Gallic cavalry charging from outside slammed into hidden pits lined with stakes, their horses screaming as they fell. Warriors rushing ladders against Roman towers were cut down by arrows before they ever reached the top. And inside, Vercingetorix's men were forced into narrow choke points where the Romans could strike them down in small numbers. Still, the pressure mounted. The relief army launched assault after assault. By nightfall, the battlefield was a nightmare of corpses, broken weapons, and firelight flickering on Roman armor. The Gauls had been repelled, but the cost was heavy. Men slumped in exhaustion. Supplies ran low. And everyone knew this was only the beginning. The relief force was not going home. They would return at dawn and the day after and the day after that until something broke. Inside Alesia, desperation deepened. Vercingetorix had no choice but to press harder. Food was nearly gone. Hunger gnawed at warriors and civilians alike. Mothers looked at their children with despair, knowing the stores of grain would not last. Some sources tell us that the Gauls, in their desperation, drove out the women and children, hoping Caesar would allow them to pass through his lines. But Caesar, ruthless in his calculation, refused. The refugees were trapped between the walls, neither welcomed by the Romans nor allowed back inside the city. Starvation became a weapon as cruel as any sword, and still the battles raged. On the second day, the Gauls changed tactics. Instead of hurling themselves against the walls in blind fury, they probed for weaknesses. They launched simultaneous attacks on multiple points, hoping to stretch the Romans thin. They sent cavalry around the flanks, looking for hidden paths. They tried to burn Roman defenses with fire. At one point, they nearly succeeded in breaking through a section of the outer wall. Legionaries rushed to reinforce the gap, fighting hand to hand in a frenzy of blood and steel. Caesar himself, according to his own account, rode along the lines, rallying his men, reminding them of the stakes. He knew that if even one section of wall fell, the entire siege could collapse. Night brought no rest. Both sides lit fires that turned the sky red. The Romans repaired their fortifications by torchlight, hammering stakes, dragging timber, digging fresh ditches, their hands blistered, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. The Gauls howled from the darkness, blowing horns, beating drums, keeping their enemies awake, wearing them down with fear as much as with steel. By the third day, the siege had become a war of endurance. The relief army launched wave after wave, but the Roman lines held. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's warriors hurled themselves again and again at the inner wall, but Roman discipline prevailed. Slowly, the Gauls began to realize the truth. Caesar's trap was working. They were being ground down, their fury wasted against unbreakable defenses, and yet there was one more card to play. The Gallic relief army was not finished. Somewhere in their vast host, leaders whispered of one final, desperate assault. An attack so massive, so coordinated, that not even Caesar's genius could withstand it. The Romans did not yet know it, but the climax of Alesia was about to begin. The day the world held its breath, night before the final assault, was eerily still. No horns, no drums, no war cries drifting through the air. Just silence. The Romans, battered and exhausted from days of endless attacks, stood watch with heavy eyes, knowing something was coming. Caesar himself sensed it. He had fought enough battles to know that silence was often the loudest warning of old. At dawn, the horizon darkened not with storm clouds, but with warriors. The Gallic relief army had gathered its full strength for one last, desperate gamble. Their leaders knew time was running out. The Romans had to be broken here and now, or Gaul would fall. And so, with every man they could muster, they prepared to throw everything into a single coordinated strike. The scale was terrifying. Imagine lines upon lines of Gallic warriors stretching across the plain, shields glinting, banners snapping in the wind. Cavalry massed on the flanks, ready to sweep around and strike from behind. War horns blared, rolling like thunder over the valley. From inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's warriors roared in unison, prepared to burst forth the moment the Romans faltered. It was a trap within a trap, Romans between walls. Gauls on both sides and no escape. The attack began with a storm of missiles. Stones from slings, arrows darkening the sky, javelins thrown with deadly force. The Romans ducked behind shields as the air filled with the hiss and thud of projectiles. Then, with a collective scream, the Gallic host surged forward. They came not in scattered groups, but in overwhelming waves. Ladders slammed against ramparts. Warriors leapt into trenches, hacking at stakes, tearing down palisades with their bare hands. Cavalry charged at the flanks, trying to find gaps in the outer wall. Fire was hurled at wooden defenses, and smoke rose into the sky, and inside Alesia, Vercingetorix struck. His warriors swarmed down the slopes, hurling javelins, battering the inner wall with sheer fury. For the Romans trapped between, it was a nightmare made flesh. They fought front and back, their world reduced to blood, smoke, and the deafening roar of battle. Have you ever felt the world closing in around you, as though every path leads only to failure? That was Caesar's reality. His men were stretched to breaking, their lines bending under the sheer weight of Gallic numbers. Reports poured in of sections under siege, towers burning, ditches filling with bodies. The Gauls were not just attacking, they were overwhelming, and then, at the weakest point of the Roman defenses, disaster struck on the northern sector of the outer wall. The Gallic relief army launched a concentrated assault. Using sheer manpower, they filled the ditches, cut through stakes, and forced their way up the ramparts. Legionaries fought desperately, but the sheer flood of bodies pushed them back. Panic rippled through the Roman line. For the first time, it seemed the walls might break. Caesar knew that if this point fell, the entire siege would collapse. He had no choice but to act. Mounting his horse, clad in his crimson commander's cloak, the symbol every legionary recognized, he rode straight to the breach. Imagine the sight, Caesar himself galloping into the thick of battle, his presence like a beacon. Wherever he rode, men rallied. He shouted encouragement, calling his soldiers by name, reminding them of past victories. Remember Britain. Remember the Rhine. His voice cut through the chaos, steady and unyielding. In that moment, Caesar was not just a general. He was the embodiment of Roman resolve. And his men responded, but words alone could not hold the line. Caesar needed more. He turned to his cavalry, held in reserve for just such a moment. With a wave of his hand, he unleashed them. The Roman cavalry thundered out from hidden gates, sweeping around the flanks of the Gallic attackers. It was a hammer blow from the side, smashing into the relief army just as they pressed hardest. Trapped between legionaries on the ramparts and cavalry crashing into their ranks, the Gallic warriors faltered. What had seemed like victory turned to chaos. Their formations broke. Their cries of triumph became screams of panic. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix fought with equal desperation. His men threw themselves again and again at the Roman walls, but now they saw their brothers outside collapsing. The sight broke their spirit. Attacks grew weaker, less coordinated, until finally they ebbed away. The great relief army, the hope of old Gaul, was in retreat. What had begun as thunder ended in silence. Across the battlefield lay the wreckage of dreams, broken weapons, shattered shields, and countless bodies. The Romans, against impossible odds, had held, and in that moment, the fate of Gaul was sealed, but the story does not end with battle. For what followed was perhaps even more haunting. Inside Alesia, with supplies gone and reinforcements defeated, Vercingetorix faced a choice. He could fight to the last man, condemning his people to slaughter, or he could surrender, and so, in a scene as dramatic as any battle, Vercingetorix donned his finest armor, mounted his horse, and rode out through the gates of Alesia. Before Caesar, he dismounted, removed his weapons, and laid them at the Romans' feet. A proud warrior bowed not just to a man, but to an empire. The war was over. Gaul had fallen. And Caesar, with this single victory, had carved his name into history, but victory came at a price. Tens of thousands of Gauls lay dead. Survivors were sold into slavery. Entire tribes were broken. The land was scarred not just by war, but by the memory of defeat. And yet, for Caesar, it was the stepping stone he needed. From Alesia, his path would lead back to Rome, to civil war, and ultimately to dictatorship. The world would never be the same. The price of glory, battlefield of Alesia fell silent. Where once the earth shook with the thunder of war cries, now only the wind moved through the carnage. The Roman legions stood among the broken bodies of their enemies, battered and blooded, but victorious. They had stared down annihilation, fought with walls at their backs and death at their throats, and yet they had endured, but victory did not feel like triumph. The fields outside Alesia were littered with the fallen, Gallic and Roman alike. The stench of death hung heavy in the air. Survivors of the Gallic relief army scattered into the countryside, their dreams of freedom broken. Inside the fortress, hunger and despair had already hollowed out the people. And then came the surrender. Vercingetorix, the man who had dared to unite Gaul, rode out in full armor, every eye upon him. Imagine the silence as he dismounted before Caesar, stripping himself of his weapons, laying them at the feet of the man who had crushed his rebellion. Some sources claim he threw his arms dramatically to the ground, offering himself as a sacrifice for his people. Others say he simply bowed his head, proud but resigned. Whatever the truth, that moment became legend. A proud king became a prisoner, and Caesar's greatest rival in Gaul was no more. The aftermath was brutal. Tens of thousands of captured Gauls were sold into slavery, scattered across the Roman world. Tribes that had once resisted fiercely now found themselves under Roman governors, their lands divided, their culture suppressed. The proud spirit of Gaul was not extinguished, but it was shackled. The hill of Alesia, once a symbol of resistance, became a graveyard of freedom. And what of Caesar? For him, Alesia was more than just a victory. It was a turning point, the jewel in his crown of conquest. With Gaul subdued, he had secured unimaginable wealth, loyal legions hardened by years of war, and a reputation that outshone every rival in Rome. The Senate could not ignore him. His enemies could not contain him. Alesia was the foundation upon which Caesar would build his final act, the crossing of the Rubicon, the civil war, and ultimately his dictatorship. But here lies the irony. Alesia was both the height of Caesar's brilliance and the beginning of his downfall. The very ambition that drove him to encircle an enemy twice his size would later drive him to defy the Senate, to seize power, and to meet his own fate beneath the knives of assassins on the Ides of March. In victory, the seeds of his death were sown. Pause for a moment and think, was Alesia truly a Roman victory, or was it a tragedy for humanity? For the Gauls, it was catastrophe. A culture of proud warriors reduced to subjects of Rome, their leader. Vercingetorix paraded in chains through the streets of the Eternal City, displayed in Caesar's triumph and then executed, strangled in the darkness of a Roman prison. His name lived on, but his people's freedom died with him. For Caesar's soldiers, it was a memory carved into their souls. They had survived one of the most desperate sieges in history, fought on two fronts, starved, bled, and labored day and night under constant threat. They had seen the genius of their general firsthand, and they would follow him anywhere. They became not just an army, but an extension of Caesar's will. And it was with these men that he would march on Rome itself, and for history, Alesia became something more. It became a symbol of strategy, of how cunning and discipline can triumph against overwhelming odds. Military academies still study Caesar's tactics at Alesia, marveling at the audacity of double fortifications, the discipline of legionaries, and the cool nerve of a general who placed himself between two enemies and emerged victorious. But beyond the strategy, there is the human story. Mothers watching their children starve inside the walls. Warriors charging again and again into certain death, driven by hope and pride. Roman soldiers digging through the night, hands blistered, knowing every trench they carved might be their last defense. And in the middle of it all, to men Caesar and Vercingetorix locked in a contest not just of armies, but of wills. So, what do we take from Alesia? Perhaps it is the reminder that genius often walks hand in hand with ruthlessness. That victory is never free, it is bought with the suffering of countless lives. That ambition can lift a man to greatness, but also plant the seeds of his destruction. Caesar trapped an entire army, yes. But in doing so, he trapped himself in a destiny that would lead, inevitably, to betrayal, and perhaps, too, it is a reminder of the power of unity. Vercingetorix, for all his defeat, accomplished what no one before him had managed. He united the tribes of Gaul, if only for a moment. His vision outlived him, echoing centuries later when others would rise against oppression. His failure was not the end of resistance, but the beginning of a legend. As we close this story, picture once more that hilltop at Alesia. The silent ruins, the wind sweeping over graves unmarked, the echoes of battle fading into history. For Caesar, it was glory. For Gaul, it was tragedy. For us, it is a lesson. So I leave you with this question: was Caesar's brilliance worth the cost? Because the siege of Alesia was not just the end of a war. It was the beginning of an empire.